questions? Yes?
ADHD.
ADHD.
Can you tell me anything about
Can I tell you anything about ADHD? I can tell you a few things about ADHD. Okay, there's a great deal of evidence that shows that omega-3 fatty acids play big roles. Nothing I talked about tonight, but they play big roles in ADHD, in the mediation or moderation of the condition. I don't know that there's a correction per se, but there's a very good way to manage it. And it's this neurological connection of how the brain works. And what we found is the evidence, if you don't mind, I'll give you a little background because it's a really compelling bit of research. The evidence is showing that behavioral disorders, ADHD and related things like that, are in this new science that says that you can't separate the structure of the brain from the function of the mind. Okay? The brain is the organ, and the mind is the thing that exists inside the organ. Right? When you don't have mind surgery, you have brain surgery, because they can't do any surgery on the mind, they can only do it on the brain. The brain is the tissue, it's the organ. The thing that we're finding now is that the relationship between the structure of the tissue, the organ, the brain, has a tremendous potential to influence the function of the mind and all of the things associated with that behavior. We see it in a number of ways. We see that mothers who have high omega-3 content in their diets, as during the full term of pregnancy, have a significantly lower risk of having a child with ADHD. Conversely, mothers who have very low levels of omega-3s in their diet have a significantly higher risk of having a child with ADHD. Okay. But it goes beyond that. Mothers who have high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in their diet have a significantly higher probability of having a smarter child. Okay? Mental acuity, physical acuity, hand-eye coordination development, eye tracking, all of those things are developed more quickly and more fully in a child whose mother had high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in her diet. Conversely, when that's low, that development is slower and sometimes impeded. We see that that is carried forth. Coming out of mom, the baby has been totally dependent on mother's omega-3. If mother's doing a good job with her diet and breastfeeds, the baby's still getting a good supply of omega-3s, right? Omega-3 fatty acids are the single most predominant fatty acid present in mother's milk. So that's nature's plan, by the way, to continue to feed that. As the child moves on and gets into eating other things, we find that preschoolers, toddlers, who have the highest omega-3 fatty acid content in their diet tend to have the fewest developmental disorders and the lowest risk of things like attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, things like that. When omega-3s are high, they have a low risk of that. Conversely, when omega-3s are low, they have a high risk. That carries over into adolescents and teenagers as well. There's evidence that shows that teenagers who have poor omega-3 status in their diet do poorly at school. They have trouble with staying on task, right? Staying focused, following through, following a subject. And study habits are directly related to how well you can focus. Right? If you can't focus your mind and stay on task, you'll wander all over the place, and that will compromise you later on. We find even greater evidence about behavior in a population study that was done in the prison systems back on the East Coast in New Jersey, where they took a group of inmates, a bunch of them, several hundred inmates, who were incarcerated because they had behavior-related problems that got them there. They're nice guys until they're not, and then they take your head off. Okay? Or they behave well until they can't, and then they do stupid stuff. Is in the population of these incarcerated criminals with behavior disorders, that when they went back and looked at it, those who were receiving the omega-3s, when they did the psychological evaluations, those who were receiving the omega-3s, and no one knew because it was blind, scored better on those psychology tests, right, on their their behavior tests, their anger trigger tests, and all of these things that they do. So it goes on throughout your life, and now we know that when you get into old age, those people who have the highest omega-3 fatty acid content in their diet throughout their life have the lowest probability of Alzheimer's and other cognitive loss of memory and cognitive functionality, all of the things that your brain does for you that you probably never even think about it doing for you. So very, very compelling stuff when you think of it in that context. And so yeah, there's a ton of information, and for somebody with ADHD, that's a great place to start. Some of the things Jim brought up about, environmental excitotoxins and things like that, you can add good things to the one side of the scale, but take as many of the bad things off the other side as you can. Let's go back here now. Yes?
Great. You mentioned Lou Gehrig's disease in relation to how farmers can affect the course of the disease.
Yes.
Is there any evidence about how carotenoids can affect multiple sclerosis?
There's some evidence, yes. I didn't include any here because it's been a little mixed. They haven't done sort of the clinical evaluations like we saw on ALS. It hasn't received, there's evidence out there, but until it gets published at least twice in serious peer review, we don't necessarily rely on it too much. So, but it's safe to say that all of these degenerative disease states that occur in the body, that the absence of protector nutrients, fundamental protector nutrients like carotenoids, is only going to allow for that degeneration to happen more quickly. Okay, even immune function compromised, even if it was an indirect, lack of the carotenoids and therefore compromised immune function that allowed it to go there. Yes?
Can you remember what you took when you had that bad motorcycle accident and you were in the hospital for 2 weeks?
What I took when I got there? Actually, I didn't really change anything. I had a Harley. And I rode it for years. I rode it for, I rode motorcycles for about 40 years. And at 40 years and a few days, I guess, some lady changed lanes in front of me, and whoever's got the handlebars in my mind is responsible. So I just leaned over to avoid her, but as I got to the side of the road, Caltrans had been working on the road and it busted up the edge, so it just dropped off. And the front tire went down in there, and then the back tire went down in there. And then I was on the brakes, but it was gravel at that point. And then right there was this big old pine tree. So I leaned over, but I took it right up this side. So it dislocated this leg, put it up near my left ear, and broke this and did that. But, I recovered like that. So I really didn't do anything differently because I was already doing everything. I told the guy, I went into Stanford, and they were surprised, impressed, or whatever, at how quickly I recovered. And I said, that's because I was ready for it. I was. No, seriously. You never know when something's going to happen. Sometimes people think of nutrition as a response. That's a drug mentality, right? It's a drug mentality, and you have to think of it differently. You don't wait to get a headache to take, you can take aspirin, but you usually wait to get a headache and take an aspirin. But you don't wait for a disaster to get your body prepared for it. You prepare for it now. So my body just kicked into overdrive and said, immune system, yay! No problem, let's clean this up. And I was up and out of there in, I think, 36 hours. Yes, over here.
What would you say someone with ligament damage, stuff like that going on?
Ligament damage?
Yeah, ligament and tendon damage, what would you want to take? Like if someone hadn't been ready?
Well, if they hadn't been ready, yeah. Well, that happens with most people who aren't ready. It would depend upon the nature of the damage, and if your ligament is completely detached from its bonding point, then I imagine you should have it reattached, probably surgically. That's the only choice you had. But there will always be a localized inflammation there. It will always be a little sensitive, and it will always, because of that, be an immune challenge. That will always be an area that your body has to clean up. Remember that your immune system is your body's janitor as well. That's who goes around and cleans up the mess, right? When I go like that, I just created some mess. A whole bunch of red blood cells went, what was that? A few of them burst, So who's going to clean up the mess? Well, my immune system just said, okay, we got it, boss. So, you have to think of it in the context of that. We have a product called Full Motion, very, very helpful. Probably you're going to get a little arthritis in that area over time, so you want to use something that will help reduce arthritis. Omega-3s, Full Motion, carotenoids, CalMag, and things like that are going to be your best bet. Ligature is a proteinaceous material, so you want a really good, high-quality protein like the NeoLife shake in your diet every day. I take one of those every single day, every morning. Every morning. I love these little packs. Every morning I take one of those because I know that that's the best, that's what my body needs the most of, I can, all day long, everything else will be there, but high quality protein is hard to come by. Not, burgers are not high quality protein. There's some protein there, but there's more harm than good. Yes.
Okay, you just mentioned that you get those little protein packs.
Yes, that's the privilege of being on the SAB. Yes, sir. Carotenoids and rheumatoid arthritis. Well, again, rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease. Some people think if I boost my immune system, I'm going to make my autoimmune disorders bigger. Not true. It's a different process in your immune system. They're not related. So you want to strengthen your immune system because rheumatoid arthritis creates tissue sensitivity that creates an immune challenge. So that omega-3 is probably the single biggest thing. Anything that ends in itis is an inflammation, right? So anytime you've got an inflammation around a joint, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or any other form of arthritis, salmon oil plus is the best way to go. I can do an hour on salmon oil plus if you want. No. One question, and then I'm going to tell you a couple of things that Louis asked me to say. Louis, you should never ever let me get to the front of the room and say, take as long as you want.
Amen.
Yes, you.
I heard that carotenoids are good for your eyes, are they?
Yes, carotenoids are very good for your eyes.
What does it do?
Yeah, there's a few things it does. Again, you've got a lot of interocular fluid in there, and keeping that fluid cleaned up, a lot of debris, you get floaters and things like that. That's part of the function of your immune system. That's an aqueous, a water-soluble solution. But the movement of those, handing them off and getting them into the immune system and out of the way, is a function that carotenoids can promote. But particularly in the back of the eye, there's an area called the macula lutea. It's the area of tight focus. It's the area that allows you to look at a letter and read that letter. If you think about it, you ever take a magnifying glass and go out and light a piece of grass on fire with the sun? Okay, that's light being focused on a point and make heat. Well, your eye does that. Your eye takes these highly charged particles of energy called light, and it focuses it on this little thing in the back of your eye called the macula lutea. So there's a lot of energy going on there. These are a lot of photons, a lot of light energy that strikes the back there. And what the macula lutea does is respond to that and still allow you to get tight focus. And two carotenoids in particular, lutein and zeaxanthin, take up residence in that tissue at the back of the eye and function as the protectors. They mediate all of that energy and the oxidative forces that those energy puts on that tissue. The macula lutea has the same Latin root as the carotenoid lutein. It's a yellowish color. If you look back in there or get your ophthalmologist to take a picture of the back of your eye, they'll do that these days. It's interesting. Get them to do the video for you. You'll be amazed at what you see inside there in your own eyes. But that little place back there will be yellow, and it's because lutein and zeaxanthin, but lutein in particular, are yellow. So very, very powerful at mediating this high-stress area of tissue that's constantly being bombarded with photons, just like that grass you burned with a magnifying glass. Now, Louis asked me to make a comment about GMOs, okay? And I'm very passionate about GMOs. We've been passionate about GMOs since the 80s. Way back in the 80s is when we first started making decisions in the SAB and in our supply networks that would make sure that GMOs never entered our product line, and they never will enter our product line. We don't allow them. Every ingredient that has genes or a genetic source has got a genetic identity for us. But understand why we're so concerned about this. In nature's plan, or God's plan, you choose the way you want to. I have trouble separating the two. In the plan, okay, there's a very, very direct differentiation of species, okay? Plants are plants, and animals are animals, and microbes are microbes, and never the twain shall meet. Even within plants, plants are different plants. Roses can't mate with camellias, not on purpose, okay? And mice can't mate with rats, dogs can't mate with cats. And that's there very, very specifically. If you think about it, if that were possible, over time, the whole thing would degenerate into an undifferentiated mass of something. I mean, think about it. What differentiates, the importance of genetic differentiation is how we maintain the separation of species, the separation of tissue. If dogs could mate with cats, we'd have dats. But think about that. Of course you have to do that. Of course there needs to be differentiation. Of course you can't have a cross-contamination. So, what has, in all of their glory, companies like Monsanto done? They have created an abomination. They have violated the separation of species. In the Roundup-resistant soybean, okay, they took the soybean, and then they took a gene from a marigold, and they implanted it into the soybean. The reason is you can spray Roundup on marigolds all day long, and they just thrive. So they thought, wow, you know, if we could get that over here in a soybean, that would be great. People would want to use more of our product called Roundup, wouldn't they? So that's what they did. They put it in there. And then they thought, well, that's good. First generation, that works. So we had these Roundup-ready soybeans. And then they thought, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could own that? If we could own the genetic code of the soybean. I don't know who gave them the right to buy it or what makes them think they have the right to own it. It's ours. Okay? Every living person on the planet owns the genetic code of the soybean, not Monsanto or any other company. Okay, so now, what they said is, wow, if we could get this thing to do certain things for us, if we could make it so that the soybean that's produced is infertile, so that the farmer couldn't grow his own seed, they'd have to come to us and buy the seed. So they took a gene from a mouse, a gene from a mouse, an infertile mouse, and implanted it in the soybean and created this frankenbean, right? This thing that is not really a soybean. It's not really a soybean. A soybean, the genetic sequencing of a soybean is very clearly defined. This is not that. And your genetic identity is your identity. Therefore, it is not a soybean. They shouldn't even be allowed to call it a soybean. Really, because it's not. And then they thought, well, we need to find a way that we can control this to make sure that the farmers we contract with are using our soybean. So they took a gene from a bacterium and implanted it in the soybean. And in the presence of a certain test that they do out in the field, that bacterium will fluoresce. It will give a color so they can tell in the field while they're growing the beans if those beans are in fact grown with their patented soybean stuff. Now, you get it? I mean, do you understand what they did? They took the basis of all of creation, the separation of species, and they violated that And they're not the only ones doing it. It's happening all over the place. You've heard of the super salmon that they're trying to get out there, right? Where they took the genes of a flounder and put it into a salmon. The reason is flounders grow twice as big, twice as fast. They eat twice as much, too. But wouldn't that be nice? If I can get a salmon from a salmon egg to marketplace in 8 months instead of 28 months, how much money can I make? Holy smoke, holy cow, roll up the bank vault. The problem is, what do you suppose would happen if this creature ever got out into the environment where the other salmon are, where the wild salmon are? In just a few generations, they would eat up all of the natural salmon food supply and completely drive them into extinction. And then we'd have these salmon that aren't salmon, flounder that aren't flounder things out there. Okay. So, this genetically modified thing, we go to great lengths to make sure that everything that we put in our product has a genetic identity. We establish a genetic identity. For the carrots and carotenoid complex, it has a genetic identity. We know and specify the seed stock that the carrots are grown from, and we demand that the fields that these carrots are grow only this genetic seed stock. And along the way, we check the genes all the way up the line. And when you look at that little number, the batch code on the side of that bottle of carotenoid complex or salmon oil plus or whatever product is out there, recognize that unlike the vast, vast, vast majority of companies, we can take that number and track it all the way back down the supply line, all the way back to the seeds it was grown from in the fields where it was grown. Because that's really the only way you can be in control of this thing. Now, you saw that thing Jim put up there, 94% of all the soybeans grown in the United States are genetically modified. Key phrase there is in the United States, okay? A lot of the rest of the world has said no. Not maybe, not, they just point blank said no, you don't get to do this. Now, the food industry's finding tricky ways around it. You say, okay, we won't feed it to people, we'll feed it to the cattle that the people are going to eat.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just a bad, bad, bad thing. Okay. Yes?
So if you go to the store and you buy a certain item and it says no GMO, can we believe it?
Well, I think you need to know the store and you need to know the maker. If it's yes, I would say mostly in a reputable store, probably yes. The reason being is that that's a statement that is such a sensitive trigger these days that they're being watched pretty closely when you make that. So yes. We say, we don't say it on our labels, we come out and tell you that we don't have any genetically modified organisms in any product. In particular, what you want to be concerned with, just so you know, is what we call transgenic DNA. It's the actual DNA that has been modified. In that GMO roulette, remember how they showed the DNA and how it rolled out and replicated over time, and it could spin off all these variables? When you consume a food that contains DNA, DNA is very small stuff, right? When you consume that and it gets down, it could interact with the microbiota, the bugs in your gut, and be taken up and absorbed and somehow potentially alter them. We don't know how yet. We only know that in theory it's possible. Right? Or it could be that it could become part of something that's absorbed into you and becomes part of your tissue, and somehow over time works its way in and starts messing with your personal DNA. It might not be tomorrow. My guess is that we are going to have a lot of genetic diseases, a lot of DNA disorder diseases that are going to come out of this. Keep in mind that in the scale of humankind, this is a grand experiment that's taking place with about a second's worth of preparation. Right? We've been here doing this a long time. Everybody that's alive on the planet today represents the genetic expression of a species who thrives in the presence of what was put before it to live. Because if we didn't, we were weeded out. That was the trigger system. That was the mechanism. You know, those of us who are alive today represent the genetic code of a species that thrived in the presence of what was put before us as our sustenance. In the last little while, we've been messing with the sustenance, right? At a pace that is so fast that we cannot respond genetically. Our system can't respond fast enough to deal with that because it's happening like this. So it's a grand experiment, and we really won't know for some time what the outcome is going to be, but it's very likely not going to be pretty. Yes, ma'am?
What if GMO creations eventually fade out?
Will it eventually fade out?
Yeah, wouldn't they naturally fade out because they're not?
Well, yeah, here's the deal, okay? Anybody who knows anything about GMOs isn't going to buy and eat any, okay? Which is why they don't want to label it in this country, okay? The food industry fights so hard because they know if it says contains GMOs, no one's going to buy it. And when they can't make any money, that's when it'll fade out. So yes, eventually, you know, it's like anything else. It's sort of like a behavioral disease that exists in the population of food producers at the moment. And eventually, when they find they can't make any money of those, they'll stop making it. That's the basic laws of how the deal runs. When there's no money to be made, nobody does anything. So there's a GMO labeling bill going around in Washington, D.C. right now. I suggest you contact your local representative and senator and say, I want to know. I have a right to know what's in my food supply. And just tell us. Let us make the decision. Who are they to think that they can hide this from us? What makes them think that they have the right to do this? You know, they're public servants after all. They don't recognize it. Most of them have got a misplaced idea of their importance. Seriously, don't get me off on that subject. But there are public servants, you know. All we want to do is know and be able to make the decision for ourselves. So let them know. Talk to them about it. Talk to everybody about it. Get everybody to do it. Because if they think, just like if the food people don't think there's any money, they won't make it, right? If our legal representatives think they won't get reelected, they'll stop backing it, you know, and start coming over to our side. Okay? It's a sad commentary, but it's true. Oh, here's one here. Yes, sir.
Will GNLD ever be able to certify the products as non-GMO?
Certify it by a third party, you mean?
Yeah, or at least something that, you know, people interested can look at it and know offhand.
Well, you know, we do have a position statement on SAB letterhead that states in very simple, clear terms that we do not have any do not use any genetically modified ingredients. In particular, there is no transgenic DNA, that's that modified DNA in any of our products. So if you would like a letter to that effect, you can get it from the office. Yes? Talk to your distributor services representatives. It's a standard letter in the question and answer database. And so, yeah, I guess that answers that. Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot of these websites that recommend products that are good and healthy and so on and so forth. How do they go about choosing and the products that they recommend? And how, I mean, is GNLD approached in?
Have we been approached by people who want money in order to endorse our products? Because they don't do it for free.
Okay.
And yes, we have, and you'll see that we've actually paid money. We have a kosher certification on some of our products, have for years. And we do that because a lot of people feel that's important. But we pay to have those inspections done, and we pay every year to have that done. So there are lots of folks out there who will, you give them the right amount of money, they'll give you the right blessing, if you will. So when we don't feel the need, you know, we have a reputation for excellence that goes on for decades and decades and decades. And you have a scientific advisory board seal. That's a pretty big endorsement. One last question, though I'm just now getting up to stride.
How do you feel about the recently passed Monsanto Protection Act?
The Monsanto Protection Act? I think if you make it plain to your senators and Congress people that you don't like that and ask them, what is your position? Don't give me any double talk political garbage. Are you for or against this? Plain and simple. I asked that to one of my representatives. She didn't like it. They don't like to not have room to dance. You know, they don't say yes or no, just yes or no. Well, you see it, they said no, yes or no. So if you do that, then you'll change it. But just the food lobby in general and Monsanto and others like that, and there's some big ones out there, have huge amounts of money, and sadly, they buy huge amounts of influence. And it's not what they're doing, it's what they're doing without letting us see it. You know, if they want to mess with the genes of a soybean, go right ahead. But make it plain to me that the product that I may eat has got that in it, so I can decide whether or not I'm going to eat it, not make it something that you get to decide in the halls of Congress or some back room in a political action committee or something. Anyway, I really appreciate this. Hopefully you got some information this evening that you can learn. What you need to do is, I'll leave this PowerPoint presentation here, so all of that references and all of those scientific articles, you guys can all play with them and do whatever you want. But people need to understand this. They really need to understand that it's bad enough that we are eating all of the junk that we're eating, but it's even worse when you do that and don't try to compensate a little bit by getting some good stuff in, and there's nothing better than GNLD. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam.